The slap lasted barely a second. 1 second that cut through the bass-heavy pulse of Inferno like a gunshot, froze the security detail by the VIP section, and turned a bartender's reflexive boundary into something that couldn't be taken back. Lena Voss felt it immediately, the sting radiating from her palm up through her wrist, the sudden vacuum where club music had been, the way every conversation within 20 feet died mid-sentence. Her hand had connected with his cheek before her brain registered what she'd done. Already defensive, already forming the words to tell him he'd earned it. But the man didn't retaliate, didn't even raise his voice, didn't blink. He stood there across the bar, impossibly still in the crimson neon glow, his jaw tight where red was already blooming across his skin. The tattoos crawling up his neck seemed to pulse in the light. His shoulders filled the black suit like architecture, the kind of frame that didn't need to move to communicate threat. It was the kind of presence that made the air heavier just by existing, the kind that warned you to recalibrate everything you thought you knew about power. Lena's righteous anger faltered. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she'd just signed her own death warrant. "You good?" she asked, forcing steadiness into her voice that her racing pulse contradicted. His eyes finally lifted to her face, dark, cold, completely focused. They didn't scan the room for witnesses. They didn't flicker with the rage she expected. They locked onto her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve before deciding her fate. "I was leaning too close," he said quietly. It wasn't an apology. Lena swallowed, suddenly aware of how the space between them felt both too wide and suffocatingly close. She nodded once. "Yeah, you were." The club around them kept churning. Bass vibrated through the floor. Someone screamed with laughter near the dance floor. Glass shattered at a table in the corner. But here, at the bar, everything had gone still. He placed one hand on the bar surface, not reaching for her, but close enough that his presence became a cage made of expensive cologne and barely leashed danger. His other hand stayed loose at his side, fingers relaxed in a way that somehow felt more threatening than a fist. "You don't know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. She lifted her chin, meeting those cold eyes even as her survival instincts screamed at her to look away. Should I? That earned her something new. Not anger, not amusement, interest. He studied her for 3 more seconds, and Lena felt each one like a physical weight. Then he stepped back, releasing her from the invisible pressure of his attention as smoothly as if he'd never invaded her space. He pulled a money clip from his jacket pocket, extracted a $100 bill, and placed it on the bar with the kind of precision that suggested everything he did was calculated. "Next time someone leans too close," he said, his voice carrying an edge that could cut glass, "make sure you know what they're capable of before you touch them." Then he turned and walked toward the exit, his security detail falling into formation around him, like satellites orbiting a dark star. Lena stood frozen behind the bar, her palm still burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the $100 bill, then at his retreating back as the crowd parted for him without being asked. Her co-worker Jessie materialized beside her, face pale in the red light. "Holy shit," Jessie whispered, her voice barely audible over the music that had resumed as if nothing had happened. "Lena, do you have any idea who you just—" "Who?" Lena interrupted, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Jessie's eyes were wide, reflecting equal parts terror and disbelief. "Dante Moretti." The name hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with implications Lena didn't want to understand. But she would. Soon enough, she would understand exactly what that name meant, exactly what kind of man she'd just struck, and exactly how much danger one reflexive slap had brought crashing into her carefully controlled life. Behind the bar, Lena's hand was still shaking. But whether from adrenaline or fear or something else entirely, something that felt disturbingly like anticipation. She couldn't say. Want to know what happens next? That slap was just the beginning. If you're loving this kind of cinematic storytelling and drama-packed narratives, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. New episodes drop regularly, and trust me, you won't want to miss what Lena learns about the man she just slapped. Subscribe now and join the story. Lena typed his name into the search bar at 3 a.m., her apartment dark except for the laptop's glow. Dante Moretti, 2 words that had been ricocheting through her skull for 3 days. The results came back fractured, incomplete, like someone had taken a razor blade to his digital footprint and carved out everything that mattered. There were FBI investigation records that ended abruptly with insufficient evidence stamped across case files dating back a decade. Tax documents for a dozen legitimate businesses, nightclubs, restaurants, real estate holdings, all registered under his name, all perfectly legal on paper. Society page photographs where he stood beside city councilmen and police commissioners, his expression unreadable in a tailored tuxedo, his hand extended in greeting like he belonged there. She scrolled deeper. Reddit threads full of speculation and deleted comments. A news article about a warehouse fire in Red Hook that killed 3 men, their identities never confirmed, the investigation quietly closed. Another about a prosecutor who'd been building a racketeering case before abruptly resigning and moving to Oregon. The pattern was clear. Dante Moretti existed in the spaces between evidence and rumor, where the law couldn't quite reach, and people knew better than to look too closely. Lena closed the laptop, her pulse thrumming with something that felt uncomfortably close to fascination. She'd slapped a ghost, a man who moved through the world leaving nothing behind but whispers and bodies that never surfaced. 3 nights later, he walked back into Inferno. Lena saw him immediately, felt him before she saw him. Actually, that same shift in atmospheric pressure that made her skin prickle. He moved through the crowd like water parting around stone, his security detail 2 steps behind, and claimed a seat at the far end of the bar, where the lighting turned amber instead of red. He ordered water. Just water. Then he settled onto the stool with the patience of someone who had nowhere more important to be, and he watched her. Not the way men usually watched her at the club, that predatory assessment she'd learned to deflect with sharp words and sharper glares. This was different. Clinical, almost. Like he was studying her movements, cataloging the efficiency with which she poured drinks, the way she handled drunk customers with a smile that never reached her eyes, and the precise moment when her professional mask slipped and irritation flickered across her face. 4 hours. He sat there for 4 goddamn hours, nursing the same glass of water, never checking his phone, never looking away for longer than it took to blink. When she moved to the other end of the bar, his eyes followed. When she took her break, he waited. When she came back, he was still there, still watching with that unsettling focus that made her feel like she was being memorized. Other patrons tried to approach him. His security redirected them with a single look. A woman in a dress that cost more than Lena's rent leaned close and whispered something in his ear. He didn't even turn his head. Lena's hand started shaking around midnight, not from fear, but from the mounting pressure of being observed, dissected, understood by someone who shouldn't care this much about a bartender who'd slapped him. She wanted to march over and demand to know what he wanted, why he was here, what kind of game this was. But she didn't, because the message was already clear, transmitted through 4 hours of silence louder than any threat could be. He wasn't done with her, not even close. When closing time finally came, and Lena looked up from wiping down the bar, his stool was empty. No goodbye, no parting words. Just absence where his presence had been, and a tip on the counter that made her stomach drop. 5 crisp $100 bills weighted down by her own fear, and nothing else. The coincidences started small enough that Lena almost convinced herself they were accidents. Almost. Tuesday morning, she walked into Rosie's diner for her usual breakfast shift meal: black coffee, scrambled eggs, toast she could barely afford, and found Dante Moretti sitting in the corner booth with a newspaper spread across the table like he'd been there for hours. He glanced up when she entered, his expression neutral, offered the slightest nod of acknowledgement, then returned to his reading, as if her presence changed nothing. Lena's appetite vanished. She ordered coffee to go and left. Thursday, her bus broke down 6 blocks from her apartment, stranding her in the rain with 24 other commuters. She was digging through her bag for her phone when a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, the rear window sliding down to reveal a man in a crisp suit she didn't recognize. "Ms. Voss," he said, his tone professionally distant. "Mr. Moretti asked me to offer you a ride." She told him exactly where he could tell Mr. Moretti to go, then walked 3 miles in the downpour out of pure spite. By Saturday, the tips at Inferno had escalated into something obscene. Every drink she poured for him, always water, always the same deliberate patience, came with $200 left on the bar, never personally handed to her, never acknowledged. Just there, crisp bills that felt like an insult wrapped in temptation, a reminder that he could solve her problems with pocket change if she'd only bend. She lasted until Sunday. Lena found him in the back alley behind Inferno during her break, and leaning against the brick wall like he'd been waiting for her, smoke from his cigarette curling up into the sodium lights. His security was nowhere visible, but she knew they were close. They were always close. "Stop," she said, her voice sharper than the cold air between them. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, stop." Dante took a slow drag, exhaled, then dropped the cigarette and crushed it beneath his shoe with precise finality. "You want me to leave you alone?" "Yes." "No, you don't." He straightened from the wall, and suddenly the alley felt smaller, the shadows deeper. "You want to understand why I haven't made you disappear for what you did." Lena's jaw tightened. "I defended myself. You were in my space." "I was." He took 2 steps closer, stopping just outside her arm's reach, but close enough that she could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "And you slapped me in front of a room full of people who've killed for less. You embarrassed me, disrespected me, touched me like I was just another drunk asshole you could put in his place." His voice was calm, almost curious. "I didn't break your wrist. I didn't have my men drag you into a car. I didn't make you vanish into the river." The air between them crackled with unspoken violence. "Don't you want to know why?" Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Why?" Dante's smile was slow, dangerous, and completely without warmth. "Because I'm not done figuring you out yet." The restaurant occupied the top floor of a building Lena didn't know existed, all glass and exposed steel beams with the city sprawling below, like a circuit board of light. She'd agreed to come only because Dante had asked instead of assumed, his tone in that alley shifting from threat to something closer to invitation. Now, standing in a space that should have held 100 diners, but contained only 1 table set for 2, Lena understood the difference between money and power. Money rented the room. Power emptied it. Dante pulled out her chair himself, no staff visible anywhere, just them and the skyline, and the weight of a conversation she wasn't ready for. "You didn't have to do this," she said, settling into the seat because standing felt like conceding different ground. "I know." He sat across from her, his suit jacket gone, her shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a way that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. The tattoos on his forearms were intricate, deliberate, not the impulsive ink of youth, but the calculated art of someone who understood permanence. "But I needed you to hear this without an audience." Hear what? He leaned back, studying her with that same unnerving focus she'd felt across the bar, but closer now, more intimate. You're not afraid of me. That's rare. Most people see me and their brain does the math, calculate threat, determine escape route, decide whether survival means compliance or flight. He paused, something flickering across his expression that might have been exhaustion. You slapped me and asked if I was okay, like I was just a man who'd invaded your space, not a monster, not a god, just a man who needed to be corrected. Lena's fingers tightened around her water glass. You were. I was, he agreed. And I'm tired, Lena. Tired of people who treat me like I'm something other than human. Tired of conversations where everyone's working an angle, measuring their words against my potential for violence. Tired of being alone in rooms full of people who die for me, but won't look me in the eye. The honesty felt like a weapon he'd laid on the table between them, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to ignore. So what do you want from me? She asked quietly. Nothing you're not willing to give. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I'll walk away right now if that's what you want. I'll disappear from the diner, from the club, from every place you exist. But you need to understand something first. His jaw tightened. The night you slapped me, a dozen phones recorded it. By morning, every crew in the city knew your face, knew your name, knew you'd embarrassed me publicly. Some saw weakness, others saw opportunity. Lena's stomach dropped. You've already been seen with me, Dante continued, his tone matter-of-fact, in a way that made the words more terrifying. 3 diners, 1 club, a back alley. People talk. People watch. And right now, there are men calculating whether hurting you would hurt me, whether taking you would give them leverage, whether making you disappear would send the message that I've gone soft. She wanted to call him a liar, to insist this was manipulation. But the way he said it, clinical, resigned, like he was explaining weather patterns instead of threats to her life, made it impossible to dismiss. So my choices are what? Bitterness crept into her voice. Let you control my life or risk dying for slapping the wrong asshole. Your choice, Dante said, holding her gaze with an intensity that felt like gravity, is whether you trust me to keep you alive while you figure out what you actually want. The city glittered below them, indifferent and beautiful. Lena realized she'd stopped breathing. Lena told Dante she needed time to think. He nodded, called his driver, and sent her home alone in a car that cost more than her annual salary. She spent the ride convincing herself she could still walk away from this, that his warnings were exaggerated, that she could return to her life and pretend a Mafia boss hadn't just offered her protection she hadn't asked for. She made it 3 blocks from her apartment before she noticed the headlights behind her had been there too long. The car was dark, nondescript, following at a distance that would have seemed casual if Lena hadn't spent the last week learning to see threats in empty spaces. Her keys were already between her fingers when she reached her building's entrance, her pulse hammering as she fumbled with the lock. The car slowed, stopped. A door opened. Then another car appeared from nowhere, slamming into the curb between Lena and the man now stepping onto the sidewalk. Dante's security poured out with the efficiency of soldiers, and what happened next lasted maybe 20 seconds, but would replay in Lena's mind for weeks. She saw the enforcer's hand move toward his jacket, saw Dante's men move faster, saw the brutal economy of violence that left the man on the ground, bleeding from somewhere Lena couldn't identify, his face pressed into concrete, while one of the security detail spoke calmly into a phone. No shouting, no drama, just professional brutality executed with the precision of men who'd done this 100 times before. One of them turned to Lena, his expression apologetic. "Ma'am, we need to move you now." She was shaking too hard to argue. Dante's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Tribeca, accessible only by private elevator that required a fingerprint and a code. The doors opened onto a space that didn't feel like a home so much as a statement. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, furniture that belonged in museums, art on the walls that Lena recognized from documentaries about auctions where millionaires bid against each other for sport. Everything was steel and glass and angles, beautiful in the way a knife was beautiful, expensive, deliberate, sharp. Dante was waiting in the living room, his jacket discarded, a drink in his hand that he didn't appear to be drinking. He looked at Lena, took in her shaking hands, and the shock still written across her face, and something in his expression softened. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "That man is being handled." He set down his glass with controlled precision. "He won't come near you again. None of them will." Lena's laugh came out bitter, edged with hysteria. "Because you'll have them beaten in the street?" "Yes." No apology, no justification, just honesty sharp enough to cut. "That's what my protection looks like. That's what I was trying to explain at dinner." The room felt too large and too small simultaneously. Lena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly exhausted in a way that went bone deep. "I can't go home." "No," Dante agreed. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a while." He gestured toward a hallway. "Master bedroom is yours. Everything you need is there. I'll take the couch." She stared at him. "This is your home. And you're my guest." He picked up his drink again, still not drinking it, just holding it like he needed something to do with his hands. "I'm many things, Lena, but I'm not the kind of man who invites a woman into his home and then expects payment for the privilege. You'll have privacy, you'll have security, and you'll have time to decide what happens next." Lena wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need his charity, that she could handle this herself. But the image of that enforcer's face hitting the concrete was still too fresh, the understanding of how easily she could have disappeared still too raw. "Okay," she whispered. Dante nodded once, then turned toward the windows, giving her his back, offering her the small dignity of not watching her break. The first morning, Lena woke to silence so complete it felt hostile. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, just the hum of climate control and her own breathing in a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, wrapped in sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She found Dante in the kitchen at dawn, already dressed in slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, making breakfast with the focused precision of a surgeon. "Coffee's fresh," he said without turning around. "Eggs or French toast?" She stood in the doorway, still wearing the clothes from last night, feeling displaced in time. "You cook?" "I do a lot of things people don't expect." He plated eggs with exact spacing between components, scrambled eggs, toast points, fruit arranged like architecture. "Sit." It became a ritual. Out every morning, Dante cooked, while Lena slowly learned the geography of his life. The living room shelves held philosophy texts, Camus, Nietzsche, Marcus Aurelius, their spines cracked from actual reading. Poetry collections she wouldn't have guessed he'd own, Neruda, Bukowski, Mary Oliver. A first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo with passages underlined in pencil, marginalia in handwriting that matched the notes he left her about security protocols and when his men would be changing shifts. She found him reading at 2 a.m. on the third night, unable to sleep, standing by the windows with a book in one hand and that ever-present untouched drink in the other. Insomnia had carved shadows under his eyes that made him look human in a way the tailored suits never did. "What are you reading?" she asked from the hallway. He held up the book. "Meditations. Helps sometimes." Does it work? No. A ghost of a smile. But the trying matters. By the 5th day, they'd established an uneasy domesticity. Dante worked from home, calls in Italian and English that Lena pretended not to overhear, his voice shifting between languages with the same precision he used to dice vegetables. She explored his world in careful increments, the art collection he never explained, the locked study she didn't ask about, the way he moved through space like he was constantly aware of sight lines and exits. "Tell me about the bar," he said one evening over dinner he'd insisted on making. "The one you want to open." Lena looked up, surprised he remembered. "It's stupid." "Tell me anyway." So she did. About the place she'd imagined since she was 22, working double shifts and saving money that never accumulated fast enough. Exposed brick and honest drinks, somewhere people could exist without pretense, where she could build something that was entirely hers. She talked until her coffee went cold, and Dante listened with the same intensity he brought to everything, like her dreams mattered as much as his empire. "What stopped you?" he asked. "Reality. Money. Fear of failing." She met his eyes. The usual things that stop people from becoming who they want to be. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Your family doesn't know about it." It wasn't a question. Somehow he'd already guessed. "My family doesn't know about a lot of things." Lena's voice went flat. "Haven't spoken to them in 3 years. My father thought bartending was shameful enough. Owning a bar would have been unforgivable." "Their loss," Dante said simply. 2 words, but the way he said them, matter of fact, with no pity or false comfort, made something in Lena's chest loosen. "What about you?" she asked. "What did you want to be before you became this?" Dante was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, alive. Just alive. Everything after that has been improvisation. The vulnerability in those words hung between them like smoke, beautiful and suffocating. And Lena understood that they'd both been trading pieces of themselves. Currency exchanged in the language of people who'd learned trust was expensive, and silence was safer. The first morning, Lena woke to silence so complete it felt hostile. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, just the hum of climate control and her own breathing in a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, wrapped in sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She found Dante in the kitchen at dawn, already dressed in slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, making breakfast with the focused precision of a surgeon. "Coffee's fresh," he said without turning around. "Eggs? Or French toast?" She stood in the doorway, still wearing the clothes from last night, feeling displaced in time. "You cook?" "I do a lot of things people don't expect." He plated eggs with exact spacing between components. Scrambled eggs, toast points, fruit arranged like architecture. "Sit." It became a ritual. And every morning, Dante cooked, while Lena slowly learned the geography of his life. The living room shelves held philosophy texts, Camus, Nietzsche, Marcus Aurelius, their spines cracked from actual reading. Poetry collections she wouldn't have guessed he'd own. Neruda, Bukowski, Mary Oliver. A first edition of The Count of Monte Cristo with passages underlined in pencil, marginalia in handwriting that matched the notes he left her about security protocols and when his men would be changing shifts. She found him reading at 2 a.m. on the 3rd night, unable to sleep, standing by the windows with a book in one hand and that ever-present untouched drink in the other. Insomnia had carved shadows under his eyes that made him look human in a way that tailored suits never did. "What are you reading?" she asked from the hallway. He held up the book. "Meditations. Helps sometimes." "Does it work?" "No." A ghost of a smile. But the trying matters. By the 5th day, they'd established an uneasy domesticity. Dante worked from home, calls in Italian and English that Lena pretended not to overhear, his voice shifting between languages with the same precision he used to dice vegetables. She explored his world in careful increments. The art collection he never explained, the locked study she didn't ask about, the way he moved through space like he was constantly aware of sight lines and exits. "Tell me about the bar," he said one evening over dinner he'd insisted on making. "The one you want to open?" Lena looked up, surprised he remembered. "It's stupid. Tell me anyway." So she did. About the place she'd imagined since she was 22, it working double shifts and saving money that never accumulated fast enough. Exposed brick and honest drinks, somewhere people could exist without pretense, where she could build something that was entirely hers. She talked until her coffee went cold, and Dante listened with the same intensity he brought to everything, like her dreams mattered as much as his empire. "What stopped you?" he asked. "Reality? Money? Fear of failing?" She met his eyes. The usual things that stop people from becoming who they want to be. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Your family doesn't know about it." It wasn't a question. Somehow, he'd already guessed. "My family doesn't know about a lot of things." Lena's voice went flat. "Haven't spoken to them in 3 years. My father thought bartending was shameful enough, or owning a bar would have been unforgivable." "Their loss," Dante said simply. 2 words. But the way he said them, matter of fact, with no pity or false comfort, made something in Lena's chest loosen. "What about you?" she asked. "What did you want to be before you became this?" Dante was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, alive. Just alive. Everything after that has been improvisation. The vulnerability in those words hung between them like smoke, beautiful and suffocating. And Lena understood that they'd both been trading pieces of themselves. Currency exchanged in the language of people who'd learned trust was expensive, and silence was safer. The social club occupied a brick building in Little Italy that looked like it hadn't changed since 1952, its windows frosted with age. The sign above the door announcing nothing except an address. Dante's hand rested at the small of Lena's back as they entered. Not possessive, but present. A claim made through proximity that every man inside immediately registered. The room went quiet in that way. Lena was learning to recognize, not silence, but recalibration. Every person reassessing the space now that Dante had entered it. Men in expensive suits and cheaper ones rose from card tables and leather booths, their greetings respectful to the edge of reverence. Dante introduced her to faces she'd remember later. Marco, his second, built like a wall with eyes that missed nothing. Vincent, older, silver-haired, who looked at Lena with something between curiosity and concern. Tony, young and eager, who held Dante's coat like it was a religious artifact. "Gentlemen," Dante said, his voice carrying without volume. "This is Lena. She's under my personal protection. Anyone who forgets, that won't need to worry about remembering anything else." No one laughed. No one questioned. They simply nodded, and Lena understood she'd just been declared untouchable in a language that needed no translation. Dante guided her to a back room where the real business happened. Dark wood, cigar smoke, despite the no-smoking laws. A table where decisions were made that never appeared in court documents. 3 men were already seated, their expressions ranging from neutral to hostile. Dante took the head of the table with the ease of someone who'd never questioned his right to that position, gesturing for Lena to take the chair beside him. The negotiation that followed was conducted in careful language, words that meant one thing on the surface and something lethal underneath. A shipment that needed to arrive on time, a territory dispute that required resolution, a name mentioned with particular emphasis, someone who'd made poor choices and would need to be educated about respect. Dante spoke with the same precision he brought to cooking breakfast, laying out terms that were clearly non-negotiable, while allowing everyone to pretend they were still talking instead of being told. One man pushed back, his voice rising. "With all respect, the timeline's unrealistic." Dante's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted, temperature dropping degrees. "I wasn't asking for input. I was informing you of expectations." The man went pale, apologies stumbling over themselves. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises. But Lena had seen what lived underneath, the understanding that Dante's courtesy was a choice, not a weakness, and choices could be revoked. They walked to the car in silence, the city loud around them, Dante's security maintaining their invisible perimeter. He opened her door himself, slid in beside her, then turned with that searching look she'd come to expect. "Are you afraid of me now?" he asked quietly. "Now that you've seen what I actually do?" Lena thought about the men who'd risen when he entered, the negotiation that was really a threat wrapped in business language, the violence implicit in every word. She thought about his insomnia and his poetry, and the way he'd listened to her talk about her dreams like they mattered. "No," she said finally. "I'm afraid of what you could become if no one ever sees you as human." Dante went very still, his jaw tight, something flickering across his face that might have been pain or recognition, or both. He looked away, out at the city he controlled through fear and favors, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "That's what I'm afraid of, too." The meeting took place in a private dining room at Salvatore's, a restaurant that had been neutral ground for 50 years, where deals were brokered and wars were prevented or declared with equal frequency. Lena watched from the car as Dante prepared himself, straightening his cufflinks with the same precision he brought to violence, his face arranging itself into the mask she'd learned to recognize, the one that made him untouchable, unreachable, dangerous. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "Yes, I do." He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. This is the only language they understand. The 5 families were already seated when Dante entered with Lena at his side, his hand at her elbow both proprietary and protective. She recognized the shift immediately. These weren't his lieutenants who deferred without question. These were equals, or close enough that they believed it. Old men, mostly, with faces carved by decades of calculated cruelty. They looked at Lena the way vultures looked at wounded prey, assessing, calculating, finding weakness. Dante didn't wait for pleasantries. "Gentlemen, this is Lena Voss. As of tonight, she's under my personal protection. She is consort to this family, which means she is untouchable. Any action taken against her will be considered an act of war against the Moretti organization." The silence that followed had teeth. Sal Giordano, 70 if he was a day, leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's quite a declaration, Dante. I'm over a bartender." "Over a woman I've chosen to protect," Dante corrected, his voice flat. "The distinction matters." "Does it?" This from Carlo Benedetti, younger, ambitious, always looking for angles. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're making yourself vulnerable for pussy." "Forgive my language, miss," he added with mock courtesy toward Lena. Dante's expression didn't change, but Lena felt the temperature drop. "Careful, Carlo. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Carlo gestured around the table. "You call this meeting, make this big announcement, and then what? We're supposed to adjust our operations around your girlfriend's feelings?" "No." Dante pulled an envelope from his jacket, placed it on the table with deliberate care. "You're supposed to adjust to the new reality. I'm restructuring. My legitimate businesses, the restaurants, the real estate, the clubs, they're being moved into a separate legal entity. Clean money, clean operations, completely disconnected from our traditional revenue streams." The old men exchanged glances. Sal's smile faded. "You're going legit?" "I'm diversifying," Dante said, "and I'm withdrawing from the drug trade entirely. That market's yours to divide however you see fit. I want no part of it." The room erupted, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Soft, weak, compromised. The words came from multiple directions, but the message was unified. Dante Moretti had become a liability. Dante let them rage for exactly 30 seconds. Then he stood, and the violence implicit in that simple movement silenced them faster than shouting ever could. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice carrying, despite its quietness, each word sharp enough to cut. "I'm offering you an opportunity to expand into territory I'm vacating. I'm giving you a gift. But if any of you mistake this restructuring for weakness, if you think my desire to legitimize makes me soft, if you believe protecting one woman means I've lost my edge—" He paused, his eyes moving across each face, holding each gaze until they looked away. "Test me. Please. Test me, and find out exactly how much hasn't changed." The promise of violence hung in the air like smoke. Sal cleared his throat. "And if we accept this restructuring, then we maintain our alliance. You respect my territory, I respect yours. Lena remains untouched. Everyone profits." Dante's smile was cold enough to freeze blood. Seemed simple enough. No one argued. No one dared. The call came at 2 a.m., Marco's voice tight with a control that barely masked panic. "We're bringing him up. Get the medical kit from the bathroom cabinet." Lena was already moving before her brain caught up, hands shaking as she found the surprisingly well-stocked first aid supplies, her mind conjuring horrors that somehow weren't as bad as the reality when they brought Dante through the door. Blood soaked through his shirt on the left side, his face pale under the penthouse lights, but he was walking, barely, leaning heavily on Marco and Vincent, but walking. His eyes found Lena's immediately, and something in his expression tried for reassurance, even as he left a trail of red across the white marble. "I'm fine," he said, which was such an obvious lie that Lena almost laughed. "Couch. Now." She was already opening the kit, on her bartending experience with drunk fights, translating to something useful as she assessed the damage. Gunshot wound, through and through from what she could see, high enough to miss vital organs, but low enough to bleed like hell. "Someone want to tell me what happened?" "Carlo Benedetti decided to test whether the boss was serious," Marco said flatly, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth. "He won't be testing anything again." Dante winced as Lena cut away his shirt, her hand steadier than she'd expected as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic that made him hiss through his teeth. "It was sloppy," he said, almost apologetic. "I saw him coming, just not fast enough." "Shut up and let me work." Lena's voice came out sharper than intended, fear translating to anger, because that was easier to handle. The bullet had passed clean through, which meant no extraction needed, just cleaning and bandaging and hoping infection didn't set in before a real doctor could look at him in the morning. Her hands moved with methodical precision, packing the wound, applying pressure, wrapping bandages with a tightness that made Dante's breath catch. Marco and Vincent left once she had things under control, their presence dissolving into the night, along with whatever cleanup Dante's response to Carlo had required. The penthouse fell silent except for Dante's labored breathing and the distant hum of the city beyond the glass. "I'm building an exit," Dante said suddenly, his voice rough with pain and something deeper. "From all of this, the restructuring isn't just business strategy, it's a roadmap out." Lena's hand stilled on the bandage she was securing. Out of what? "The life I was born into, the violence, the constant calculation, the knowledge that every decision might be the one that gets me killed." He looked at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes was more shocking than the blood had been. I thought it was impossible. Thought once you were in this world, you stayed until it buried you. Then you slapped me and treated me like I was just a man who needed correction. And I realized, his voice cracked. You see a future in me I'd given up on. Lena sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood, her heart hammering against her ribs. Dante, I'm falling in love with you, he said, the words coming out like a confession, like something painful being extracted. Have been since that first night, and I want to be someone worthy of that slap, someone who can walk away from this and build something real. The truth sat between them, raw and impossible, and terrifying. Lena felt tears burning behind her eyes, her chest tight with emotions she'd been trying not to name. I'm falling for you too, she whispered. But wanting to leave isn't the same as actually leaving. I need proof, Dante. I need to know you can really walk away from the violence, that you won't just restructure it into something with better optics. Dante reached for her hand with his uninjured arm, his grip weak but certain. Then I'll prove it. Whatever it takes. 6 months could change everything or nothing, depending on who was counting. For Lena, standing behind the bar of her own place, exposed brick, honest drinks, her name on the lease, it felt like both. The Voss room had been open for 3 months, funded by an investment from Dante that they both knew was more gift than business arrangement, though he'd insisted on proper contracts and quarterly reports, as if she might actually pay him back someday. He came in on a Tuesday evening during the quiet hours, when the after-work crowd had dispersed and the late-night regulars hadn't yet arrived. Lena was wiping down the bar, mentally running inventory, when the door opened and Dante walked in, wearing jeans and a simple black shirt. No security detail visible, no expensive suit serving as armor. He looked almost ordinary, if ordinary men carried themselves with that kind of coiled certainty. We're not officially open yet, Lena said, unable to stop the smile that spread across her face. But I suppose I can make an exception. I appreciate that. He took a seat at the bar, the same spot he'd claimed on opening night and every visit since, and accepted the water she poured without asking. Some things didn't change, even when everything else did. They'd seen each other regularly over the past 6 months, watching his empire transform from whispered threats to legitimate enterprise. His criminal operations had been handed to Marco with Dante's blessing and strict boundaries drawn. The restaurants, the real estate, the clubs, they all operated under Moretti Holdings. Now, completely legal, completely clean. With Dante's name on business cards instead of in FBI files, he'd been shot at twice more, survived 1 poisoning attempt, and buried 3 men who'd tested whether his restructuring meant weakness. But he'd survived, and more importantly, he'd kept his word. So, Dante said, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass with uncharacteristic nervousness. There's something I need to ask you. Lena's heart kicked against her ribs. Okay. He stood then, and for a moment Lena thought he was leaving. Instead, Dante Moretti, who commanded respect through violence, who'd built an empire on fear and strategy, who'd never bowed to anyone, got down on one knee beside her bar. The world narrowed to his face, his dark eyes steady despite the tremor in his hands, as he pulled a small box from his pocket. 6 months ago, you asked for proof that I could leave the violence behind, that I could be someone worth trusting with your future. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. I can't promise I'll ever be completely free of what I was. Can't promise threats won't come, that my past won't try to drag me back. But I can promise that every choice I make from here forward will be toward the man you saw in me when you slapped me that first night, the one who was just human enough to need correction. He opened the box. A simple ring, elegant in its restraint, caught the light. Lena Voss, I'm offering you the one thing I've never given anyone, a choice without consequences. Say no, and nothing changes between us. I'll still invest in your bar, still show up on Tuesdays, still be falling in love with you from whatever distance you need. But if you say yes, his voice roughened. If you say yes, then we build something real together. Not just a life, but a future where your courage becomes my redemption. Lena looked at him, this impossible man who'd transformed himself because one bartender had refused to be intimidated, who dismantled an empire to prove he could be more than his worst impulses, who was offering her forever while genuinely meaning she could walk away. She thought about that first night, her palm connecting with his face, the moment that had changed both their trajectories. Not a slap this time. This time she held out her hand. Yes,